Welcome to the patrons only video for today, which there are two components of what we're looking at today. One is the case of the missing verse, which is Acts 8:37. Where did it go? And then at the very end, I talk a little bit about Isaiah 53, because this week we looked at Acts 8 in my daily podcasts and Greek videos. Well, let's go ahead and start. So here is Acts 8:37. And Philip says to him, if you believe with your whole heart, it is permissible. Nothing wrong with the verse. I want to make that very clear. No one today thinks there's something wrong with this verse. There's no conspiracy. Oh, they don't, the first inkling of people who hear this for the first time is, okay, what did they not believe in this verse? They didn't believe in faith. What horrible, evil people they are. They didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. What fiendish heretics they are that took this verse out. And of course, that's a completely mistaken understanding of the situation. Well, let's look at the verses in context. Verse 36, and the eunuch says to Philip, look, water, what prevents me from being baptized? Verse 37, and Philip says to him, if you believe with your whole heart, you can be baptized. And answering, the eunuch says, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Verse 38, and he commanded the chariot to stop. Okay. Nothing at all wrong with these verses. I would be perfectly happy if this verse was original. It just probably isn't. Okay, so textual criticism, again, the truth really doesn't care about whether we're offended or our feelings are hurt or whether we go in. Frankly, the truth doesn't care if we go into a faith crisis. Now, what do I mean by truth? I mean, what is the case? Obviously, Jesus is the truth, but that's talking about truth in a slightly different way. We're talking about, is this a cup? Is this not a cup? Truth in that sense. So there is a truth question. Was this verse in the first copy of Acts, or wasn't this verse in the first copy of Acts? How that truth affects me is a completely different question. It's a pastoral question. But the question of whether the verse was there or not is a truth question. Was it there or was it not there? Okay. And textual criticism is the branch of biblical studies that addresses questions like, was this verse there or was this verse not there? Now, of course, there is a textus receptus branch of textual criticism. In my opinion, this is a group of very intelligent people who basically, again, you don't have to agree with me, obviously. I won't be offended if you disagree with me. Just don't shoot me. That people who grew up with the King James and loved the King James, and so when they found out about this stuff, instead of going with the most likely conclusion, as is often the case, they use their intellect to try to find a way to come up with a less likely, that sounds like it's likely, right? Those who argue for conspiracy theories often sound like, oh, this is obvious. There's a big skew here. And I'm not saying there can't be skew. I'm just saying that, in my opinion, this one's not even close from a evidence standpoint. And so there's a whole group of minority scholars, not a lot of them, but there is a whole group of minority scholars who have applied their considerable intellect to finding ways to read the evidence in a different way. And I want to make it very clear, they are very intelligent, probably more intelligent than I am. They certainly know the evidence better than I do. This is not the way truth works with human beings. The intellect of human beings doesn't mean you're right. Intellect often just equips you better to argue for your own idiosyncratic position. And I'm sure that's true of me, except at some point I went through a faith crisis because of these things, and I decided I was going to go with where the evidence lied, where the evidence lay, rather than not where the evidence lied. Evidence doesn't lie. Well, the evidence can lie. That's a different story. Okay, moving right along. So textual criticism is the branch of biblical studies that tries to determine what the original text read. And it uses two kinds of evidence, external evidence and internal evidence. External evidence is the evidence of the manuscripts. That is, there are no original copies to any of the books of the Bible. And so external evidence asks, how do the manuscripts read on this particular topic? So the earliest Greek manuscripts do not have this verse. P45 is very early. I'm trying to remember. I think it dates to the to the 200s. Let me get out my handy dandy notebook here, and I can look it up. I should know this by now. P45 dates from the 200s. Hey, I was correct. Let's see where P74 dates from. P74 dates from the 600s, so that's not as helpful. The P stands for papyrus. These are the oldest of our manuscripts. Okay, this is Codex Sinaiticus. This is Codex Vaticanus. Both of these date from the early 300s. They are very old. And of course, it was these two manuscripts that led the way in overthrowing the Textus Receptus. The Textus Receptus is the Greek text behind the King James Version. The Textus Receptus was edited in the 1500s, basically, starting with a man named Erasmus. I like Erasmus. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be negative toward these people. These were great, intelligent people, but they worked with the evidence they had. Erasmus worked with the evidence he had. Codex Alexandrinus dates from the 500s, and then minuscule 33. A minuscule is a cursive manuscript. They tend to be later. These capital letters refer to uncials. Uncials are all caps manuscripts, and then papyrus manuscripts are the P ones. 33 stands for a minuscule. It's a medieval manuscript. But it's considered to be one of the better of the cursive manuscripts of the Middle Ages. Of course, there's a little circularity in here. Why is manuscript 33 thought to be better? Because it reads like these uncial manuscripts and papyrus manuscripts. So there's a little circularity as to why 33 is considered a better manuscript. Okay, the vast majority. Here's an interesting thought. The majority text, in terms of the Greek, doesn't have this verse. In fact, some of the manuscripts that Erasmus used to create the Textus Receptus, Erasmus was the author of the first widely publicized printed Greek New Testament in 1521? I don't remember exactly when. I have a horrible brain. But Erasmus was behind the first widely circulated Greek New Testament. There was another version in Spain, but it got held up by the Pope, and it wasn't meant really for a popular audience. Not that the Greek New Testament is ever meant for a popular audience, but never mind. A whole nother story. Tangent man, alert. Okay, but Erasmus, it wasn't actually in the text of any of the manuscripts, the 6 to 12 manuscripts that Erasmus used, but it was in the margin of one of it. And so Erasmus thought, oh, this must have been in the original, and it was just carelessly put in the margin. So he put it in. So it isn't even in the majority of Greek manuscripts. I think I saw a statistic, I don't know if it's true or not, that only 1% of Greek manuscripts have this reading in it. Of course, we don't count manuscripts, we weigh them. That's a principle of textual criticism. Manuscripts are to be weighed, not counted. So it's not in most of the Syriac manuscripts, not in most of the Coptic, these are languages, not in most of the Ethiopic languages, it's not in most of the Vulgate manuscripts. Interesting. The earliest known New Testament manuscript to have it, which is Codex E, dates from the 500s. So again, it's not that we have tons and tons of manuscripts before the 500s, but the ones that do exist don't have it. Now it is quoted by, this verse is quoted by Irenaeus in the late 100s. I've found the ending of Mark seems to be quoted by Irenaeus. Irenaeus is about from the year 180. And in my opinion, Textus Receptus scholars love Irenaeus because Irenaeus seems to attest to some of these readings that modern scholars don't think are original. Now, here's the thing. Irenaeus, does he quote it from a manuscript, or is he telling what they would have said? This is the thing. Irenaeus is a witness to theology. Is he a witness here to the way the text read? Again, this shows how cleverness, in my opinion, how cleverness can be used to argue for just about anything, as we'll see in a moment with, I think it's Edward Hill. Okay, from an external manuscript perspective, it is not at all likely that these verses were original. So the other kind of evidence is internal evidence. With internal evidence, we basically ask given the internal logic of Acts 8, is it more likely that this text was added in, or is it more likely that this text was dropped out in some way, whether intentionally or unintentionally? What we do with internal evidence is we create a kind of storyboard, and we say, okay, which is the most likely scenario? So here's an example of some evidence from internal evidence. The phrase, the Jesus Christ, is not a Luke Acts expression. It's not typical. He talks about the Christ. We've already seen that in our trek through Acts. But the idea of Jesus Christ, where Christ is almost a last name, is not the way Luke talks about the word Christ. So that's an example of internal evidence, where the verse in question is not Lucan style. Now, again, this doesn't prove anything, but it's a drip, 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 a little bit of evidence. Now, this is what Bruce Metzger, may he rest in peace, former Princeton scholar, one of the modern champions of textual criticism, and a man of faith, even though he was Presbyterian, I believe. But anyway, this is what his textual commentary on the Greek New Testament says, that basically it is likely that this text was inserted in to the text. There is no reason to take it out, but it may have. He thinks it may have started as, and of course, when I say he, I mean the committee that wrote this commentary. That this verse may have started as a marginal note based on traditions such as that found in Irenaeus, and then later, as the text was copied, it may have been put in the text, with the sense that the early church would have expected there to be some sort of confession of faith before baptism. And so here we have it. We have a confession of faith. Again, that's a storyboard. Is it more likely? Why would somebody have taken this verse out? Isn't it more likely that someone would say, there needs to be a confession of faith here. And so they created one, and eventually, as it became tradition, and as the text was copied, it got put in the same way, by the way, that Erasmus does. This is what Erasmus does. Erasmus sees it in the margin of a text, and he copies it into his Greek New Testament. Now, there are other scenarios. Here's an example. I think his name's Edwin, but Hill, Edward Hill, I think is his name. He was a very staunch defender of the Textus Receptus in the late 1800s, I think it was, when Westcott and Hort were coming up with their critical edition of the Greek New Testament. By the way, it's not enough to attack Westcott and Hort. That's what some enemies of modern translations attack Westcott and Hort. But as you can see, we now have papyri that predate Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And textual criticism was around before Westcott and Hort. So you can't, if you were to go back in time and make sure that Westcott and Hort never became scholars, the same things would have eventually come forward because they were already in the water. Okay, so here's an example of someone applying their intellect, in my opinion, to come up with a plausible second storyboard. So Hill argued that this verse was taken out around 300, just in time for Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, because people were delaying their baptism. And so the idea that Philip would be baptized at the first point of his coming to Christ wouldn't have been attractive. Well, if I understand him right, this is stupid, because the text says that the Ethiopian eunuch was baptized, right? If you don't believe in baptism when you become a Christian, then you should take the baptism out, not the confession of faith. Now, I may be skewing him. I usually am. But no. Okay, so from an objective standpoint, this verse is not at all likely to be original. So the only reason why people argue that it is original is because they're sentimentally attached to it. Now, this is my belief. Now, I may be wrong, but this is my belief. And I understand it because I grew up with the King James, right? I grew up with the King James. And so you grow up hearing sermons on this verse, right? You grow up hearing this verse. And then you find out that the NIV doesn't have it in it. Oh, these evil NIV people, must be ungodly heretics. I bet God judged them, And then you write books like New Age versions of the Bible that argue these sorts of things. So this is not a conspiracy. This is just the facts, ma'am. This is purely a matter of scientific objectivity. And from a standpoint of what is likely true, this verse is almost certainly not part of the original of Acts. Is it a bad verse? No. I'm not even necessarily opposed to people preaching from it because it was in the manuscripts. Well, actually, it wasn't in the majority of manuscripts. Anyway, it's a good verse. Well, there you have it. Acts 8:37, and I mentioned in my podcast the reason why there's no verse there is because the verses were added in the Textus Receptus. The verses were added in 1550, I think it was, by Stephanus. And so when we then discovered that this verse probably wasn't original, what are you going to do? You're going to renumber everything? No, you're not going to renumber everything. That would create all kinds of confusion. And so they just left the verse out. There's just no verse there because the original manuscripts don't have it. And as I also said in my podcast, this is not a new thing. This is so hard for people to get their common sense around. The King James is a very late text. The NIV is a very, very old text. The Greek behind the NIV and the ESV and the NASB and all modern versions, pretty much, except for the King James and New King James. The Greek text behind them is much older, about a half a millennium older, 600 years maybe older than the text behind the King James. The King James is a medieval text. It is a late text. And so just because in English the King James is older than the NIV doesn't mean that the underlying Greek is that way. Okay, let's move on. Servant of the Lord in Isaiah, in Deutero Isaiah. Again, Deutero refers to the second part of Isaiah. Isaiah is often divided into three parts. So you talk about Deutero and Trito, Isaiah. Deutero is Isaiah 40 through 55. Now, whatever you think about authorship, it's clear that these chapters are talking about the return of Israel from Babylon. We know this because Cyrus, king of Persia, is mentioned, right? And he sent Israel home about 538 BC. And so that is the timing, the time. Now you can say, as John Oswalt does, that this is Isaiah having a vision of the future, or you can go, as most scholars would say, that this is a added section, an appendix, as it were, to the earlier Isaiah material. There's nothing inductively that would lead us to think that Isaiah is writing 40 through 66. That is, Isaiah's name is not mentioned in those chapters. It's clearly a different setting in those chapters, and the present tense of those chapters is in the late 6th century. So why would we even think Isaiah wrote it? It would have been on a different scroll even, right? Because 66 chapters is too long to fit on a scroll in the ancient world. So why do we think Isaiah wrote these chapters? We do because the New Testament refers to these chapters as being written from Isaiah. And so so there's no inductive evidence for the Isaianic authorship. It's a question of whether we think that the New Testament authors would have, or that the New Testament authors had to refer to these chapters in that way. So the question is, were they simply referring to these chapters given the conventions of their days, given their paradigm and their worldview, or is this a divine imprimatur on authorship? So we don't have to know anything about. We don't have to draw any conclusions on that to be able to talk about Isaiah 53. So it's quite clear from inductively from these chapters that the servant is Israel, right? Israel, my servant, Jacob, descendants of Abraham. Very explicit. That's who the servant is. And this continues throughout the section, by the way. There is no place where we can say, and here's where he changes who he's talking about. Or is there? Verse 44, listen, Jacob, my servant, Israel, again. And I haven't put all the references to servant here. In 44 and 45, clear connection to Cyrus, leave Babylon. This is a return from Babylonian captivity. That's clearly the original meaning. Now, the New Testament will give it a second meaning in relation to John the Baptist and Jesus, and that's great. Nothing wrong with that. That's the sensus plenior, the fuller sense, a spiritual interpretation. I have no problem with that sort of thing, and it's inspired, right? But so I have, as you know, if you've watched these at all, the sense that God often gives multiple interpretations to scriptures. There's an original meaning, and then there's a New Testament meaning, and then sometimes, maybe he speaks to you through it as well, and gives it a Ken Shank meaning. Now, Israel is speaking in chapter 49 in the first person. Now, that doesn't continue. The servant is calling to the dispersed of Israel. Who is speaking? Now, I said this in the podcast. You can see where the Ethiopian eunuch can begin to get confused. Who is speaking here? If the servant is Israel, then who is the servant calling to the dispersed of Israel? We do get a sense that the servant is located, I think, a little bit in Jerusalem. That the servant is a voice from Jerusalem, or shall we say, a voice centered in Jerusalem. Okay, so there is, I think, a kind of ambiguity in the text that enters in around this point, that opened up a door for the Holy Spirit to have the early church understand Isaiah 53 in relation to Jesus. I think there's a little bit of an ambiguity here as to who is speaking. Isaiah 53. Okay, so as I looked through this again this morning, and it seems to me that so here's the question: how would a Jew have understood Isaiah 53 in the year 500 or in the year 450 BC? How would a Jew have read Isaiah 53? And of course, if we're going to read how a Jew in the year 400 BC read Isaiah 53, we have to, or do we? We kind of bracket our Christian glasses for a second, bracket our New Testament glasses, and we try to get back into the head of somebody who didn't know everything about the New Testament. How would they have read it in the year 400 BC? And it sounds like it is someone now talking about, so it's Israel now talking about the Israel of the recent past. That the ancestors of the voice coming from Jerusalem, as it were, have suffered so that Israel can continue, have suffered so Israel can be restored. And so, again, I'm not saying that I'm perfect here, but I'm inductively speaking. It seems to me that Isaiah 53 would have been understood to be the voice of something like present Israel, speaking of the Israel that had suffered for Israel's sin, allowing Israel now to go forward. But like I said, this is an ambiguity, right? It's like, it reminds me of those 3D pictures where you have to stare beyond the picture for it to come out in 3 dimensions. You can see where the earliest Christians reading Isaiah 53 would now see a Jesus overlay to this chapter. So the words are set up fantastically to refer to Jesus as the one who bore Israel's sins. It reads really well that. I mean, we know this, right? We read it that way. And this is a Christian way to read Isaiah 53, and it is inspired and it is perfectly appropriate, even if there may have been a purely Jewish way, and still is today, of course, a non-Christian way of reading these verses in terms of what they meant for Israel in the late 6th century BC. Well, okay, this has been my video today on a couple things here, and feel free to start a discussion somewhere on YouTube or on Facebook or in Patreon, wherever you want to do it. And hope you have a great weekend and a blessed services tomorrow in worship.